In 1912, the world celebrated the Titanic as a miracle, unsinkable, unstoppable, and unforgettable, but hidden among the cheering crowds and polished decks was a man history chose to forget. His name was Joseph. He was the only black man aboard the most famous ship ever built, and when the ocean swallowed the Titanic, it also buried his voice. For 83 years, Joseph kept silent. He watched history unfold from the shadows. He survived a night the world would never stop talking about, yet no one asked him what he saw, what he felt, or what he lost. While others were remembered, quoted, and honored, Joseph learned a painful truth. Some stories are ignored not because they lack importance, but because the world is not ready to hear them. This is not just a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about silence, injustice, and quiet strength. It is about what happens when truth waits decades to be believed, and when Joseph finally breaks that silence, history is forced to listen. In 1912, when the RMS Titanic prepared to sail from Southampton on its maiden voyage, it was celebrated as a marvel of human achievement, unsinkable, luxurious, and symbolic of a new modern age. For most passengers, boarding the ship meant excitement, ambition, or escape. But for Joseph, the only black man aboard, stepping onto the Titanic carried a very different weight. He was not just entering a ship. He was entering a floating world that reflected the deep racial divisions of the early 20th century. Joseph's presence itself was extraordinary. In a time when segregation, discrimination, and silence were daily realities for black people, his journey onto the most famous ship in the world made him both invisible and unforgettable at the same time. Surrounded by thousands of white passengers and crew, Joseph stood alone, quiet, observant, and cautious. He carried himself with dignity, knowing that any mistake could draw attention, judgment, or worse. His strength was not loud or confrontational. It was quiet strength, the kind built from endurance. As Joseph boarded the Titanic, emotions likely swirled inside him. There may have been pride at being part of something historic, mixed with anxiety about how he would be treated. The ship was divided not only by class, first, second, and third, but also by unspoken racial boundaries. Where he slept, where he ate, and how others looked at him were shaped by assumptions rather than fairness. Even in a ship meant to represent progress, old prejudices sailed along. Joseph quickly realized that being the only black man meant being constantly watched and rarely acknowledged as an equal. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Curious stares followed him down corridors. Some passengers may have ignored him entirely, while others viewed him as an oddity rather than a person. Yet Joseph did not respond with anger. He responded with restraint. He listened more than he spoke, learning the rhythms of the ship and the moods of those around him. Silence became both his shield and his burden. As days passed, Joseph observed the contrasts aboard the Titanic. He saw wealth displayed openly, fine clothes, lavish meals, laughter echoing through first-class halls. At the same time, he noticed the quiet struggles of those below deck, especially immigrants seeking a better life. These observations deepened his understanding of how power worked, who was valued, who was protected, and who was expected to remain unseen. Joseph understood that in moments of crisis, these divisions would matter. When disaster struck on the night of April 14, 1912, the illusion of equality collapsed completely. As the Titanic hit the iceberg, panic spread unevenly across the ship. First-class passengers were warned early, others were left confused and uninformed. For Joseph, fear was layered. He was not only afraid of death, but also of being denied help because of who he was, in a world where his life had often been treated as expendable. Survival was never guaranteed. Joseph witnessed chaos, bravery, cruelty, and sacrifice, all unfolding under the cold night sky. He saw mothers clutch their children, men struggle with impossible choices, and crew members trying to maintain order as the ship slowly surrendered to the sea. Through it all, Joseph remained composed. His quiet strength surfaced most clearly in this moment. He did not push or panic. He helped where he could, offered comfort with small gestures, and held on to hope even as the ship's fate became clear. Survival, if it came to Joseph, did not erase the trauma. Living through the sinking of the Titanic was something that marked survivors forever, but for Joseph the burden was heavier. After the disaster, the world focused on famous names, wealthy victims, and heroic myths. There was little room for a black man's voice, especially one who did not fit the popular image of a Titanic survivor. Joseph learned again that silence was safer than speaking. For decades, he carried the story inside him. The memories did not fade. The sound of metal tearing, the cries in the dark, the icy water, and the realization that history might forget him entirely. His silence was not weakness. It was survival shaped by experience. He knew that telling the truth in a society unwilling to listen could reopen wounds rather than heal them. The lesson in Joseph's story is powerful and deeply human. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who are loud and celebrated, but also by those who endure quietly. Progress does not always mean justice, and greatness does not guarantee equality. Joseph's journey shows how strength can exist without recognition, and how dignity can be preserved even in isolation. At its heart, this keynote is about visibility. Joseph stood alone in a racially divided society, yet his experience mattered just as much as anyone else's aboard the Titanic. His story challenges us to ask whose voices are missing from the histories we tell and why. It teaches that silence can protect, but it can also hide truths that deserve to be heard. Joseph's quiet strength is his legacy. In a world that tried to overlook him, he remained whole. His journey aboard the Titanic is not only a tale of tragedy, but also one of resilience, patience, and humanity. By remembering Joseph, we honor not just one man, but countless others whose stories were pushed into the shadows, and remind ourselves that every life, seen or unseen, carries meaning. Joseph's story is not only about what he saw on the Titanic, but also about what he chose not to say for most of his life. In 1912, witnessing history and tragedy should have made him an important voice. Yet Joseph understood something painful and true about his time. Not every witness is allowed to be believed. For a black man living in a deeply racist world, silence was often safer than truth. When Joseph boarded the Titanic, he did not yet know he would become a witness to one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. Like others on board, he saw the ship as a symbol of progress, massive, modern, and confidently advertised as unsinkable. But Joseph also saw what many others ignored. He noticed the invisible lines that divided people, class, race, power, and privilege. Even before the iceberg, he understood that not all lives aboard the Titanic carried the same value in the eyes of society. The night of the disaster changed everything. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Joseph became a silent observer to chaos unfolding in real time. He saw fear spread unevenly. Some passengers were guided calmly toward lifeboats, reassured that everything was under control. Others were left confused, locked behind gates, or given no clear instructions at all. Joseph watched how authority worked in a crisis and how quickly fairness disappeared. He witnessed acts of courage, crew members trying to keep order, strangers helping strangers, parents putting children ahead of themselves. But he also saw selfishness, denial, and cruelty. He understood that history would later focus on heroism and elegance, but much of what truly happened would be simplified or erased. Joseph absorbed these moments quietly, knowing that memory itself can be fragile when power decides which stories survive. Surviving the Titanic, if Joseph did not mean freedom from its weight. In the aftermath, newspapers, officials, and society rushed to tell the story their way. The voices that dominated were wealthy, white, and socially acceptable. Joseph quickly realized that if he spoke, his words might be questioned, twisted, or dismissed entirely. Worse, he could face hostility for challenging the official version of events. Silence, then, became a form of protection. Joseph understood that truth alone was not enough. The world had to be willing to hear it. In his time, a black man's testimony rarely carried authority. His memories, no matter how accurate, could be doubted simply because of who he was. Speaking out could invite ridicule, danger, or emotional harm, not only to himself, but to those around him. Emotionally, this silence was heavy. Joseph carried images that never left him: the freezing night air, the distant cries, the overwhelming sense of helplessness as the ship disappeared. These memories lived inside him while the world moved on, fascinated by the Titanic as a romantic tragedy rather than a human catastrophe. He may have felt anger at times, or grief, or deep loneliness. Yet outwardly he remained composed. The silence shaped him. Over the years, Joseph likely heard others speak about the Titanic, often inaccurately. He heard myths repeated, facts distorted, and certain voices elevated while others were erased. Each time he faced a choice: correct the record or stay quiet. Each time he chose silence, not because the truth did not matter, but because he knew the cost of telling it too early. This keynote teaches a powerful lesson about who gets to speak in history. We often assume that witnesses automatically become storytellers, but for people like Joseph, witnessing came with responsibility and risk. Silence was not cowardice, it was survival shaped by wisdom. He knew his time had not yet come. Decades passed. Society slowly changed. New conversations about race, justice, and forgotten voices began to emerge. Only then did the world start to show signs that it might finally listen. When Joseph eventually broke his silence 83 years later, it was not for attention or recognition. It was for truth. He spoke because history without his voice was incomplete. His decision to wait carries an important lesson. Timing matters, but so does persistence. Truth can be delayed, but it should not be lost. Joseph's story reminds us that silence can protect a person, but it should never erase their humanity. When he finally spoke, he reclaimed his place in history, not as a footnote, but as a witness. Emotionally, breaking the silence was likely both painful and freeing. Painful because it meant reopening wounds long sealed, freeing because it allowed Joseph to finally be seen, not as the only black man on the Titanic, but as a human being whose experience mattered. His voice challenged the idea that history is fixed and reminded the world that forgotten stories can still reshape understanding. The most important lesson from this keynote is empathy. It asks us to consider how many voices remain unheard, not because they lack truth, but because the world has not yet learned how to listen. Joseph's silence teaches us to question whose stories we trust, whose we ignore, and why. In the end, Joseph did more than witness tragedy. He revealed something deeper, that history is not just about events, but about power, voice, and recognition. His silence was a mirror held up to society, reflecting its failures. And when that silence finally broke, it became a quiet act of justice, proving that even delayed truth can still change the way we remember the past. Joseph's journey aboard the Titanic opens a door to a side of history that is rarely discussed, the side shaped not by luxury and legend, but by race and class. The Titanic is often remembered as a grand tragedy filled with wealthy elites, heroic officers, and dramatic final moments. Yet beneath this familiar story lies a quieter truth. Not everyone aboard was treated the same, not everyone was seen equally, and not everyone was remembered. Through Joseph's experience, we begin to understand how deeply social divisions influenced who mattered in life, in death, and in history. From the moment Joseph stepped onto the Titanic, these divisions were clear. The ship itself was a floating model of early 20th century society. First-class passengers enjoyed spacious cabins, elegant dining rooms, and attentive service. Second-class travelers lived more modestly but comfortably. Third-class passengers, mostly immigrants, were crowded below decks, separated by gates and strict rules. For Joseph, race added another invisible layer. Even without written laws, social attitudes shaped how others looked at him, spoke to him, or avoided him altogether. Joseph quickly learned that being present did not mean being acknowledged. He moved through the ship knowing that eyes followed him, yet his humanity was often overlooked. To many, he was not a fellow passenger with dreams and fears, but an exception, something outside the norm. This quiet isolation taught him an early lesson. On the Titanic, as in the world beyond it, visibility depended on status. Wealth and whiteness brought attention. Everyone else existed on the margins. As the voyage continued, Joseph observed how class influenced daily life. He noticed who received smiles and courtesy, and who received orders or silence. He saw how rules were enforced more strictly on some decks than others. These moments may have seemed small at the time, but together they revealed a powerful truth. Value was assigned, not equal. People were ranked long before the iceberg struck. That ranking became deadly on the night of the disaster. When the Titanic collided with the iceberg, the ship's response followed the same social lines that had defined life aboard. First-class passengers were warned early and guided calmly to lifeboats. Third-class passengers, many of whom did not speak English, were left confused and trapped behind barriers. Information traveled slowly downward, and help arrived late, if at all. Joseph witnessed this injustice unfold. He saw fear and confusion in the lower decks, and urgency masked by politeness in the upper ones. He understood that survival was not just about luck, it was about access. Who heard the warnings first? Who was believed when they asked questions? Who was guided toward safety? And who was left to figure things out alone? Race played a quiet but powerful role in these moments. Even if no one openly said it, Joseph knew that his life might not be prioritized. In a crisis where decisions were made quickly, bias mattered. Who looked like someone worth saving, who blended into the background, Joseph realized that being unseen could be fatal. After the sinking, these same divisions continued. The stories that spread across newspapers focused on famous names, wealthy families, and dramatic acts of heroism. Survivors from first class were interviewed, photographed, and remembered. Third class victims were often reduced to numbers. And voices like Joseph's, black, quiet, and socially marginalized, were almost entirely absent. This absence was not accidental. History is often written by those with power, and power decides which stories are preserved. Joseph's journey reveals how easily entire perspectives can disappear, not because they lacked importance, but because society lacked the willingness to listen. His experience reminds us that remembrance is selective, and forgetting is often intentional. Emotionally, this realization carried great weight. Joseph had seen suffering up close, had felt fear and loss just as deeply as anyone else. Yet the world did not ask for his memories. His pain did not fit the popular image of the Titanic as a tragic romance or noble disaster. This quiet erasure added another layer of trauma, not only surviving the tragedy, but surviving its misrepresentation. The lesson here is both uncomfortable and essential. Joseph's story teaches us that disasters do not erase inequality, they expose it. When systems fail, the cracks reveal who was protected all along and who was never meant to be. Race and class shaped the Titanic experience from start to finish, influencing who received warnings, who reached lifeboats, and who became part of history's official memory. Yet there is also resilience in Joseph's journey. Though forgotten for decades, his perspective still matters. By acknowledging stories like his, we challenge the idea that history is complete. We learn that truth is layered, and understanding deepens when we listen beyond the loudest voices. Joseph's experience urges us to ask hard questions. Whose stories are missing from the narratives we accept? How many lives have been reduced to footnotes because of race, class, or status? And what responsibility do we have to seek out those hidden voices? In the end, this keynote is not only about the Titanic, it is about the world we inherit. Joseph's journey reminds us that remembrance is an act of justice. To truly honor the past, we must look beyond glamour and legend and face the uncomfortable realities beneath them. Only then can forgotten lives be seen, lost voices be heard, and history become more honest, inclusive, and human. For 83 years, Joseph carries a story the world does not ask him to tell. It lives inside him quietly, shaped by pain, loss, and a resilience forged in silence. This long silence is not empty. It is heavy. It holds memories of a night that changed history, and a lifetime spent knowing that truth alone is not always enough to be heard. When the Titanic sank in 1912, Joseph did not simply survive a disaster. He survived an experience that marked him forever. In the days and weeks after, the world rushed to make sense of the tragedy. Newspapers printed headlines, inquiries were held, and survivors were interviewed. But Joseph quickly understood that this attention was selective. The spotlight fell on the wealthy, the powerful, and those who fit the image society was ready to accept. His voice did not. So Joseph chose silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned what silence could do. It could protect him. It could spare him from disbelief, ridicule, or danger. In a world shaped by racial prejudice, speaking openly about his experience carried risks. He knew that his testimony might be questioned simply because of who he was. Worse, it could be ignored entirely, leaving him exposed and unheard. Silence became a form of armor, yet silence came at a cost. Joseph carried the images of that night wherever he went, the shock of impact, the confusion, the cold, the cries that echoed in the darkness. These memories did not fade with time. They surfaced in quiet moments, in the stillness before sleep, in the hush of winter nights, in the sound of water against a shore. He learned to live with them, but never to forget them. Loss weighed heavily on him. He had seen people vanish into the sea, faces that history would never name. He had watched fear turn into resignation, and hope flicker out in the cold. The world would later romanticize the Titanic, turning it into a story of elegance and heroism. But Joseph knew the truth was more complicated and far more painful. That knowledge stayed with him, unshared, year after year. As decades passed, life moved on around Joseph. Wars were fought, generations were born, and societies slowly changed. The Titanic became legend. Books were written, films imagined, and myths repeated. Joseph listened as others told the story, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes incompletely. Each retelling tested his silence. He could have corrected details, offered perspective, and filled the gaps, but he held back, knowing that the world still might not be ready to listen. This long silence required resilience. It takes strength to carry truth without release. Joseph built a life around his memories, not letting them consume him, yet never allowing them to disappear. He learned patience. He learned endurance. He learned that resilience does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Emotionally, the silence shaped Joseph's identity. It made him introspective, thoughtful, and cautious. It also gave him clarity. Over time, he came to understand that his story was not just about the Titanic. It was about voice, power, and recognition. He realized that if he ever spoke, it should be when his words could do more than simply exist. They should matter. The passage of 83 years slowly transformed the world around him. Conversations about race, justice, and forgotten histories began to emerge. People started asking harder questions about whose stories had been erased. Joseph sensed a shift. The same truth that once felt dangerous to share now felt necessary. Silence had served its purpose, but it no longer needed to carry the burden alone. Breaking that silence after so many years was not easy. Speaking meant reopening old wounds. It meant reliving moments he had carefully contained, but it also meant release. By finally sharing his truth, Joseph honored not only himself, but those who never had the chance to speak. His words gave shape to memories that had lived too long in the shadows. The lesson of Joseph's lifetime of silence is profound. It teaches us that resilience can be quiet and enduring. It reminds us that people often stay silent, not because they lack truth, but because the world lacks readiness. And it challenges us to consider how many truths are still being carried silently by others, waiting for the right moment or the right listener. Joseph's 83 years of silence were not wasted years. They were years of survival, reflection, and strength. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of time and the power of truth preserved. His story shows us that even after decades, truth can still emerge, and when it does, it can deepen our understanding of the past and our responsibility in the present. In the end, Joseph's silence was not the absence of a story. It was the story, one of pain endured, loss remembered, and resilience maintained across a lifetime. And when that silence finally broke, it did so with dignity, reminding us that truth may wait, but it does not disappear. When Joseph finally speaks, it is not a loud moment, not a dramatic confession shouted into the world. It is quieter than that, and far more powerful. After 83 years of silence, his words arrive carrying the weight of a lifetime. In that moment, his story does something remarkable. It restores dignity to a man long overlooked, proves the enduring power of truth, and reminds us that every voice matters, even when it is heard late. For most of his life, Joseph lived with the knowledge that history had moved on without him. The Titanic became legend. Books were written, speeches were given, and stories were retold again and again. Yet his experience, the view from the margins, shaped by race and exclusion, remained absent. Joseph understood that silence had once protected him, but with time it also erased him. Speaking at last was not about recognition, it was about justice. When Joseph chose to break his silence, he did so in a world very different from the one he had known in 1912. Society had changed. Conversations about race, inequality, and forgotten histories were finally taking place. People were beginning to ask not just what happened, but who was missing from the story. Joseph sensed that the moment had come, not because the pain had disappeared, but because the world was finally learning how to listen. Emotionally, speaking was both frightening and freeing. To tell his story meant reopening memories he had carefully guarded for decades. The shock of the iceberg, the fear in the darkness, the injustice he witnessed as some were guided to safety while others were left behind. These memories had lived quietly inside him, shaping his life in ways few could see. Giving them voice required courage, not the courage of action, but the courage of vulnerability. As Joseph spoke, dignity returned to him in a way it never had before. For years, he had been defined by silence imposed by society. Now he defined himself through truth. His story affirmed that his experience mattered, that his pain was real, and that his survival carried meaning. Dignity, in this sense, was not about praise or sympathy. It was about being acknowledged as fully human. His words also challenged the way history had been told. The Titanic was no longer just a tale of luxury, heroism, and tragedy among the elite. Joseph's testimony revealed the uneven reality beneath the legend. He spoke of invisibility, of fear layered with racial uncertainty, and of how class and race shaped survival itself. His truth did not erase other stories, it completed them. In doing so, Joseph proved something essential. Truth does not lose its power with time. Even after decades of silence, his voice reshaped understanding. It corrected myths, filled gaps, and reminded listeners that history is not fixed. It is living, evolving, and dependent on who is allowed to speak. His late testimony showed that it is never too late for truth to matter. The emotional impact of his story reached beyond Joseph himself. For others, especially those whose voices had also been ignored, it became a mirror. His courage validated countless untold experiences. It sent a quiet but powerful message. Your story has value, even if it has been ignored, even if it has waited too long. Joseph became more than a witness. He became a symbol of endurance. There is also a lesson here about listening. Joseph's silence was not just a personal choice. It was shaped by a society unwilling to hear him. When he finally spoke, it exposed not only past injustice, but present responsibility. His story asks us to reflect. How many voices today remain unheard because of bias, power, or indifference? And what truths are we still missing? Importantly, Joseph did not speak with bitterness. His words carried honesty, not revenge. He spoke to honor the dead, to clarify the past, and to claim his rightful place within it. This restraint made his truth even more powerful. It showed that dignity does not require anger. It requires acknowledgement. By telling his story, Joseph also reclaimed memory itself. He ensured that the people he saw suffer would not remain faceless. He restored humanity to those lost beneath statistics and headlines. In doing so, he transformed personal pain into collective understanding. The final lesson of this keynote is deeply hopeful. Joseph's story reminds us that being heard late is better than never being heard at all. Time may delay justice, but it does not erase the need for it. Voices silenced by fear, prejudice, or circumstance still carry truth. And when they finally speak, they can change how we see the world. In the end, Joseph's words do not just tell us about the Titanic. They tell us about ourselves. They ask us to listen more carefully, to question the stories we inherit, and to make room for voices that arrive quietly, late, or from the margins. His story restores dignity not only to him, but to history itself. And through Joseph we learn a lasting truth. Every voice matters, not because of when it speaks, but because it speaks at all. Joseph's journey begins in silence and ends in truth, but its meaning reaches far beyond one man or one ship. In 1912, Joseph stepped aboard the Titanic as the only black man on a vessel celebrated as the height of human progress. From the very first day, he understood what the world expected of him: to observe quietly, to endure invisibility, and to survive without complaint. When the unthinkable happened and the Titanic sank, Joseph witnessed fear, courage, injustice, and loss at their rawest. He saw how class and race shaped who was warned, who was helped, and who was remembered. And when the waters closed over the ship, he carried those memories with him, alone. For 83 years, Joseph held the truth inside. He watched history being written without his voice, legends growing where realities were ignored. His silence was not weakness, it was survival. In a world unwilling to listen, he chose patience over danger, endurance over rejection. Yet the weight of memory never left him. The cries in the dark, the faces lost to the sea, and the knowledge that his experience mattered, even if no one asked for it, remained with him for a lifetime. When Joseph finally spoke, something extraordinary happened. His words restored dignity not only to himself, but to those forgotten by history. His truth challenged the familiar Titanic narrative and revealed a deeper one about inequality, invisibility, and resilience. He proved that truth does not expire with time, and that voices silenced by prejudice can still reshape understanding when they are finally heard. The lesson of Joseph's story is clear and powerful. History is incomplete without the voices it ignores. Progress means nothing if it leaves people unseen. Silence may protect for a time, but truth, when spoken, has the power to heal, correct, and honor. Joseph's story reminds us that every life carries meaning, every witness carries truth, and every voice matters, even if it takes decades to be heard. And in listening to him at last, we do more than remember the Titanic. We learn how to remember humanity itself.